Good evening. On behalf of the Leo Baeck Institute, New York, Berlin, I would like to welcome our panelists and all of you to the closing session of our Conference on Shared History, 1700 Years of Jewish Life in German-Speaking Lands. My name is Billy Weitzer, and I am the Executive Director of the LBI, New York, Berlin. As I hope you all know by now, this conference highlights LBI's Shared History Project, marking the 1700th anniversary of Emperor Constantine's edict, granting Jews the rights and responsibilities that come with access to public offices. Throughout the year 2021, the LBI, along with our partners and contributors, will utilize exhibits, conferences, and other programs to tell the story of 1700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands. As with nearly everything during the COVID-19 pandemic, planning a conference was made much more difficult. We are pleased and thankful for the interest shown by those who submitted papers for the conference and the 24 papers that were eventually selected. I also want to thank the presenters and all of you for adapting to the changing circumstances which led to this virtual format. The opening session and the 8 paper sessions held over the last 3 years have demonstrated the breadth, depth, and importance of Jewish participation in the history of German-speaking lands. We at the LBI hope that you will stay connected to the Shared History Project as we reveal objects and tell stories that illuminate this rich history. Tonight, our panelists will discuss Shared History, Reflections on a Complex Interplay, certainly a fitting topic for our closing conversation. Shortly, we will welcome Shelly Kupferberg, journalist and moderator, whose work regularly focuses on culture and literature, as well as topics such as civil society, democracy and participation, discrimination, and migration. Shelly will introduce our 2 panelists, Professor Dr. Raphael Gross, president of the Foundation for the German Historical Museum, and Ambassador Michaela Küchler, representative for relations with Jewish organization, issues relating to anti-Semitism, international Sinti and Roma affairs, and Holocaust remembrance at the Foreign Office in Germany. I extend my deep gratitude in advance to the panelists for their participation. Before the panel begins, we will hear a special greeting from Ambassador Dr. Felix Klein. Ambassador Klein previously held Ambassador Küchler's position in the Foreign Office, and now is the Federal Government Commissioner for Jewish Life in Germany. I am grateful for Felix's advice and support as a leader, friend, and colleague.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the Federal Government Commissioner for Jewish Life in Germany and the fight against anti-Semitism, I am happy to have this opportunity to address a few words to you at this conference. Next year, we will be celebrating 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany. As participants in this conference, you are commemorating this anniversary in a particularly relevant, timely way through critical reflection, analysis, discussion, and thought-provoking input. Yours is a scholarly contribution, and this scholarly approach is exactly what we need. At a time when disinformation is gaining the upper hand in many people's minds, and facts are being ousted by fake news, conspiracy theories, and irrational thought patterns, it is all the more important for science and scholarship to take a stand and assert themselves as an antipode to these tendencies. The Leo Baeck Institute has been dedicated to researching German Jewish history and culture since its foundation and has done invaluable work in this field. The point of departure for its Shared History project is precisely where the zeitgeist gives rise to distortions of history and anti-Semitic enemy images. Those destructive narratives are countered using own narratives, fact-based narratives about 52 historical objects, opening up a new way of accessing Jewish history. They explain the individual artifact, but also illuminate the context and have the overarching situation in view. I'm convinced that the fascination of these narratives is also an effective means of combating the devastating effect of anti-Semitic patterns of interpretation and conspiracy theories that are currently poisoning our social climate. Shared history shows us how fascinating facts can be. Using an innovative concept for imparting knowledge, it shows us that the appeal of reality is frequently greater than the appeal of lies. And this message, this signal, is so important, especially right now. Not least for that reason, the federal government supports the project Shared History with total conviction. The individual objects and their stories also illustrate the major overarching themes that have always characterized the existence of Jewish people: life as a minority, migration, social inclusion and exclusion, questions of identity and self-positioning. You have been addressing these issues over the last 3 days. These are issues of growing importance for our coexistence because they affect not only the Jewish community, but the whole of our society. We are experiencing increasing religious and cultural diversity. Questions of migration and integration are an issue that is high on the political agenda. Dealing with religious, cultural, social minorities and shaping coexistence in a heterogeneous society have become central themes for us. The Shared History Conference focuses on precisely these phenomena, thus making not only a particularly interesting, but also a particularly forward-looking contribution to the anniversary year. I would like to thank you for your contribution to the conference and look forward to the virtual exhibition that will be the second part of the project, which, through your efforts, has got off to such a promising start. Thank you very much.
Ja, soweit einige Worte von Felix Klein.
Thank you very much for your words
dieses
of welcome
letzten
and
Panels,
introduction,
dieser
Willi Weitzer
Abschlussdiskussion im
and
Rahmen
Felix
dieser
Klein.
Tagung.
This is going to be
Shared
the
History,
closing panel
Reflections
of
on
the
a Complex
conference.
Interplay, also
Shared
geteilte
history,
Geschichte, Überlegungen zu einem komplexen
reflections on a complex
Beziehungsgeflecht. Wurde schon
interplay.
gesagt, genau,
That
das
is the
erwartet
topic
Sie
of this
jetzt
closing panel, and
hier
that's what
gemeinsam
we are
mit
going to
uns.
talk
Mit
about.
uns, das bedeutet zum einen mit Botschafterin
Us, that is
Michaela
Ambassador
Küchler. Ich
Michaela
freue mich sehr,
Küchler.
dass Sie heute mit dabei sind. Hallo, herzlich willkommen.
Guten Abend.
I'm really happy that you're here.
Und Professor
Thank
Dr.
you.
Raphael Groß ist bei
And
uns. Ich
Professor
werde
Dr.
beide
Raphael
Protagonisten
Groß
gleich ein wenig genauer
is
vorstellen.
here
Herr Groß, hallo.
as well. Hello.
Ja, hallo aus dem Jüdischen Museum Berlin. Gerne
Hello
hätten wir
from the
jetzt mit
Jewish
Ihnen hier
Museum
physisch
Berlin. We
gesessen.
would
Ist
have
nicht
liked to
möglich,
have
das ist
you
völlig
here as a
klar.
physical
Aber wir
audience, but
freuen
this
uns,
wasn't
dass es
possible.
auf
That's
diese
clear.
Weise immerhin
So we're
möglich
quite
ist, auch mit
happy
Ihnen,
that it's
ja,
possible to
in den
talk to you
Austausch
through
zu
the media
kommen. Deswegen
and
jetzt schon
to
einmal
have
der
an
Hinweis,
exchange as well. So if you have any comments to
haben,
make, if you have any questions,
auch anderen Panels und
maybe questions from other panels
und die Sie gerne hier in dieser
that you would still like to ask here in this closing panel, you are welcome to do this. You can use the chat that's active and open now, and you can ask your questions there.
Ich freue mich auch sehr, nochmal darauf hinzuweisen, dass wir
And I'm happy to point out that we have great simultaneous interpreters in the interpreting booth who have done great work over the last days. So thank you very much, Julia Mate and Martina England, who are working at this moment. So I'm sure if the audience were here, they would now applaud. Now you just have to imagine that. I have been introduced already. My name is Shelly Kupferberg and I'm a moderator for the Public Broadcasting Service. And as I promised to you, I'm going to introduce the panelists to you now. Michaela Küchler is the ambassador of the Federal Foreign Office and the special representative for relations to Jewish organizations, Holocaust Remembrance, fighting anti-Semitism and international matters of Sinti and Roma. So these are wide-reaching topics. She cooperates with international organizations, the like the UNESCO, the European Union. She is responsible for the cooperation with Israel and France and the OSZE, and the fight against anti-Semitism and the dialogue with Jewish organizations in Germany, the US, and Eastern Europe, and also the remembrance of the Holocaust and the genocide of the Sinti and Roma. And she is the head of the International Alliance of Holocaust Remembrance and is especially active in the field of falsification of historical facts. And Professor Raphael Groß has been the president of the Foundation of the German Historical Museum since April 2017. Many know him as the director of the Simon Dubnow Institute for Jewish History and Culture at the University of Leipzig. And he was also the director of the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, where he curated spectacular exhibitions that got a lot of attention and awareness beyond Germany. He was the director of the Leo Baeck Institute in London and the director of the Fritz Bauer Institute in Frankfurt, and he's also a member of the Commission for the return of cultural goods from Jewish ownership. So the whole thing that we want to talk about here today, the whole panel, is a room for reflection. And we know that there are more questions than there are answers about the questions of shared history. The translation itself has posed many problems, especially into German, because geteilte Geschichte in German could also be understood as separate history. But we would like to talk about the overall topic. So maybe first of all we should try to define the meaning of the title. Ms. Küchler, do we focus on the whole or on the individual elements today during this discussion, this evening? Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Leo Baeck Institute in New York for this great start of the project, which is going to keep us busy and interested for the whole of next year. 1,700 years of Jewish life in Germany, and the Leo Baeck Institute has widened this geographical area to all the German-speaking countries, and I think that was a very relevant gesture and move. Separated history, shared history. Well, for me, it's clear that we share this history. But maybe that's wishful thinking from my German perspective. Maybe a Jew in the Middle Ages who had to live in the ghetto and wasn't able to live anywhere else, or somebody who had to swear the Jewish oath and then was expelled from Nuremberg, maybe wouldn't have said that this was shared history, but just experienced separation and exclusion. So maybe we can talk about shared history after the time of the Enlightenment, after the 19th or 18th century, until maybe the dark hour of the Second World War. In the first half of the 20th century, let's say until 1933 or the years before that, actually, because of course the pressure on Jews was increasing, had been increasing for quite a while. So shared history, well, we share this history, of course, everybody has their own role to play, but it's also, there are separating elements in it, that's clear. Okay, let's ask the historian Raphael Groß. What do we understand as shared history? How do we understand this overall, and what does it mean in the context of German history? So thank you from my side of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. Thank you for inviting me at the end of this big conference. And it was very strange for me to have this through computers, but I was starting to get used to it. So as when the director of the Leo Baeck Institute, Billy Weitzer, approached me and talked to me about the Shared History Conference, I was a bit doubtful about what I would be saying during the closing panel because, as you already said, the title Shared History has so many meanings, and I wasn't sure how I would interpret it and what kind of research I would like to see happening in this project. So I would say all history is shared history for all people. So a shared history is something that happens all the time because we all share the history of the world. But what do we mean in this specific case? What do we mean when we talk about German Jewish history? This is where things become more complex. Michaela Küchler already pointed out that we have to define first what century we're talking about. Do we talk about the era of emancipation? Do we talk about the time before that? Do we talk about the Holocaust or the time after 1945? So I would say that the Leo Baeck Institute as an institution has influenced the writing of history, German Jewish history, in the 1950s, or they even invented it, because before that there was no such thing as German Jewish written history as a subject. And Leo Baeck Institute was the institution that started that. So there are certain questions that we were always especially interested in. The history of emancipation, was that a success story or was it a failure? Reinhard Rürup emphasizes that it's a success story, or was it a story that was doomed to fail from the beginning? So what's specific about the German Jewish history, and is it different from other countries? Especially the combination of the idea that legal emancipation leads to a kind of assimilation, culturally speaking or religiously speaking or socially speaking, that these two are coupled. This idea was shared by Jews and non-Jews in the 18th and 19th century in German-speaking lands. And in France, that wasn't the case. In France, you had the same legal rights, the same legal situation. First the women, then the peasants, and then the Jews. And that happened during the revolution. And in the German-speaking lands, there was this aim of social mobility, and maybe this caused resistance right from the beginning, because social inclusion was kind of part of the emancipation problem. So that is something that people don't agree on yet. So I would like to add something about the history after 1945, after the Holocaust. I feel that, well, it became clear to me during my preparation to this conference that there are people who are very interested in this German Jewish history, Germans who are very interested in this part of our history, and I ask myself, why are they so interested in it? And I would say they are interested in it because of the Holocaust. Let me give you one specific example. In the office next to me in the Jewish Museum that I was directing for 10 years in Frankfurt, there was an overall edition of the yearbooks of the Leo Baeck Institute. And this edition was passed on to us from a scientist who was an expert on statistics, and he worked through all these yearbooks. He was a member of the Circle of Friends of the Leo Baeck Institute and was extremely fascinated by Jewish history and worked through all the details of these yearbooks. And he was somebody who people don't know anymore today. He was the one who wrote the report for Himmler about the murder of the European Jews and then presented that report to Hitler. So he was the expert for Nazi statistics. And he was extremely interested in Jewish history and part of the member of the supporters of the Leo Baeck Institute. So he had his own personal interest in that Jewish history. So people tend to think that scholarly interest prevents you from being a bad person. But in German history, that is not true, as this office neighbor of mine shows. Another person who gave me just as much to think about is a man who was, well, it's a quite well-known story. He was the chief editor of the Piper publishing house. He was responsible for the books that Hannah Arendt published with his publishing house. His name was Rösner. He used to be a high-ranking official of the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst or security service of the NSDAP, the Nazi Party. In his position as SS Obersturmbannführer, he was responsible for the department C3 on culture and arts, and he was the editor of Hannah Arendt's book on Rahel Varnhagen and later also of her book on Eichmann in Jerusalem. He wrote her long scholarly letters about how she should be interpreting Jewish emancipation and the success and failures of Rahel Varnhagen, and he tried to convince her, as we were able to show in the letters which we displayed in our Arendt exhibition in the History Museum, that the word Jew should not be part of the German translation of the title, because, as he said, it wouldn't be popular and she should rather focus on Romanticism. And he also interfered a lot with her book on Eichmann. So this means that there are many different interests involved in our shared history. For me, it is not so easy to say that shared history is a positive notion and we can all identify with it. I would say shared history is a multifaceted term and there are different interests involved, some of which I personally agree with and find worthwhile and relevant, while others are very problematic, and we should be aware of this. And I noticed that there hasn't been any scientific research so far examining who is actually interested in history and why. Well, maybe there's somebody in the audience here today who thinks, finally I have the topic for my PhD thesis. We see that these questions are not easy to answer. I thank you very much, Raphael Groß, for these very impressive examples, for these paradox continuities that make this topic so problematic. Now I would like to move from your interesting practical examples to the work of Ms. Küchler. Ms. Küchler, how do you experience the question of identity in your work with Jewish organizations? How do they negotiate the question of belonging and their relationship to the majority society and the field of tension around that? Well, in the beginning, I felt quite tense about that. I come from a family that is part Jewish, as my grandfather was Jewish, but apart from some memories, it didn't play a role in my childhood and my youth. I was never in touch with Jews. It was only through my work that I got in touch with Jewish organizations. At the beginning, I was feeling a little self-conscious, but I realized right away that this wasn't necessary. I believe that there are specifically Jewish points of view. I notice, for example, that now, during the pandemic, when I open the newspaper, Jüdische Allgemeine, or other Jewish publications, that they have a very strong focus on the protection of life. There is, for example, a trend to get vaccinated in order to protect others. This point is highlighted much less in the German mainstream media.
And it's very interesting to have the specifically Jewish view on things, because this is an enrichment, and I'm very happy that in 700 years this element is very topical, of course, but it also existed in history in the past. It will give you more emphasize that more people, the attention of more people is raised, and this is makes it very interesting. And I think that we Germans link Jewishness very strongly to the Holocaust. We tend to do so, and we see Jews as victims of National Socialist persecution, and we just forget about the centuries before that and turn a blind eye to this. And therefore, this is an excellent opportunity to broaden our view. Yes, of course, this is a very important thing, to have different points of view. We see this especially in Germany when we talk about 30 years of transformation, political transformation. 30 years later, we had interesting opinions about the transformation, but the wall is just one example. We can also talk about the night of pogroms, the Crystal Night, for instance. Is it normal? Is it something which is natural, that we have completely different standpoints and viewpoints? Is the Holocaust shared history in the sense of inclusive history? Can we say that? As I tried to explain at the beginning, this term is very diverse, of course, and of course, you can also use the term shared history, but you can also talk about violence, violent history. The question is, what is your aim, your goal? We see, when we talk about the German colonialism, there is a strong necessity to talk about shared history, like the German Southwest Africa, for instance. So how can we use this term? How are we talking about huge acts of violence, events of violence, genocide, crime against humanity? Of course, there is not only one simple viewpoint, not one simple history that you can reconstruct as a shared history. It's very much about the conception of the idea that historians or politicians from different take a stand from different positions and different biographies and discuss the story of these countries together, so that they don't do it in separate views. And I would like to come back to the history of the Leo Baeck Institute that was established in 1955 and has a very long-standing, successful history, a very international history, could never decide to establish an institute in Germany. There is a lot of discussion around this, and of course they have a dependence, but not an institute itself. And this has been very contested. But it's been it was 20 years ago that there were strong frictions within the institute about the question of doing so, because they always had the idea that there are very different perspectives, and we don't want to mix them, to mingle them. There was a scientific working group of the Leo Baeck Institute with a very long and very complicated title And then there was another, like a subsidiary of the Leo Baeck Institute New York, but it was not an independent institute. And this is maybe because there is an idea that historians have different ideas, different standpoints, different biographies. And when it started in the 50s, there were functionaries of the German Jewry who escaped, or maybe children who were exiled in children's transports, for instance. And I had the opportunity to get to know them. John Grenville, he left off Berlin after the Kristallnacht, just to name one of the examples. And many of them were very strongly threatened, but managed to escape, and they lost a lot of family members. And they recorded the memories of this story. And it took many years until they found a shared history, a joint history. And maybe the majority of the German Jewish history has been written in Germany. This is a very long story, and it's very interesting to have a look at it. Yes, thank you very much for your thoughts and this strong hesitation to face these terms. And we have one remark from the audience. Well, the term shared history was strongly rejected because history is not shared, not equally divided, not equally shared. Neither Jewish history nor colonialism. We could use entangled history, would be much better. Well, thank you very much for this remark. And we have a question, a very concrete question. How do we deal with the stories and histories of minorities? Because 1/3 of the German population are post-migrants. Why does the German government not fund or not support these places of democracy's history, and the post-migrant stories are just forgotten? Maybe this is a question to Ms. Küchler. Well, I would counter and ask, do you think so? Because next year we will have the opportunity to see the anniversary of the recruitment agreement between Germany and Turkey. And I remember a visit to an immigration museum in Bremen. There is a small, maybe in the meanwhile, a bigger annex dealing with immigration to Germany, the history of immigration. So, of course, we realize that there is a history of immigration, maybe not that strongly as a history of majority society. There is more space for action. But I wouldn't say that this is true. So the 50 years anniversary of this recruitment agreement with Turkey is something that appreciates the contribution of immigrants who came to Germany in the 50s and 60s. But maybe there could be a chair for migrant history in a university, of course. Yeah, these perspectives have been actually demanded in the last 30 years after the fall of the wall, of course. First of all, we had to admit that that we are a migrant society, there is migration. And first of all, I would like to speak about the occasion of this conference, 700 years of Jewish history in Germany. We've heard a lot about it with different objects and exhibition and objects that will be shown on an internet platform telling a story. Ms. Küchler, what are the potentials behind this? You mentioned that it's very good to speak about something else than the Holocaust, because we always mention this topic. But what potentials do you see in this narrative or this story of 700 years of shared history? What are the new questions that are raised? New approaches? Well, first of all, 700 years of Jewish life in Germany means that probably there had been a much longer history, because this number is based on a document from the year 321, and it's a question put to the Emperor Constantine: are Jews allowed to have a public office in Cologne? And if such a question is raised, then you can assume that Jews had lived in Cologne before, of course, and this was not the first moment that they just appeared. It's not just these 700 years, 1700 years. And this is something that should make us proud, that there has been a minority in Germany for such a long time. I think that there is a great opportunity in the fact that Leo Baeck Institute decided for a digital format, because this enables a lot of people to participate. If it was an exhibition, a physical exhibition in Berlin, or a traveling exhibition passing different places in Germany, then only those people could see the exhibition who go there. In a digital format, the whole world can participate. And we, as a Federal Foreign Office, we would like to make a contribution by asking our representations abroad to make some marketing for this series of events in their countries. There are different objects shown by the Leo Baeck Institute: religious, secular objects, objects linked to persecution, linked to success. And I think this will open up new avenues to deal with the diversity, the multifaceted Jewish lives. Maybe we find parallels, and of course, maybe more people will deal with these topics, and we hope that people will not reject it when they get to know this story, and there will be more acceptance for Jewish minority in Germany. And now I ask our audience, what opportunities do you see in this kind of dealing with history, even if the number of years is not necessarily true, but I'm very much interested in what aspects can you think of? How can we think of history? I am, because it's at least 700 years of Jewish history. This is something that the Jewish Museum tries to depict, or more, even more, 2,000 years of Jewish history up to the present. And what opportunities, what chances do you see in this? How do you what other aspects can we have? Well, I think this is very exciting. This long time is very helpful because it enables different perspectives. The last exhibition I did in Frankfurt in the Jewish Museum was an exhibition about Jews in the north provinces of the Roman Empire in times when there was no Christianity at all, but they already had Jewish settlements in Eisenstadt or in Cologne at some individual places. And we did this exhibition because we had no idea about it. It's a very complicated and very difficult task to deal with this. And I think that it opens up new perspectives. And I believe that it makes it possible to question certain terms, concepts used in connection with Jewish history, with German history, and to have a new look at them, because I'm always very careful when I talk about minorities. I avoid using the word minorities when I talk about Jewish history or Jews, because I think minority is a legal term which is strongly linked to the 20th century and Versailles, and it's usually a language minority like the Sorbs, or because I think German Jews didn't want specific rights, they just wanted equal rights. They never demanded minority rights like Jews in Poland or in Eastern Europe, where they clearly were a minority as Jewish communities, but in German lands, this was different. Therefore, they did not define themselves as minorities. They used the term German citizens of Jewish belief. This is what they used, but they did not consider themselves Jewish minority, and they never demanded specific rights. They just wanted to have the same rights. And this is a huge difference to Jewish history in other parts of Europe, and it's very specific, very particular in Germany. And maybe this could be linked to this 1700 years of history. And it's a huge difference when we talk about migrant societies, because Jews never considered themselves being a migrant minority or migrant community, but they actually they had the opinion that they've always been there. And this is a very interesting point, because we talked about how to talk about German-Jewish relations after 45, but we can also talk about Heine or Hermann Cohen. These tries to establish Germanness, Jewishness. These play a very important role in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And after the Holocaust, we think that this is very awkward, because you just can't imagine something like that. Yes, the Jewish symbiosis is also an important question, yes. Thank you very much for this differentiation. You can ask your questions, you can make remarks. Now, especially in Germany, with this history, remembrance policy or remembrance is a very important point. And now I would be very interested in this narrative that you don't consider yourself being a minority, but a German citizen of Jewish belief. You can find another definition, of course. Michaela Küchler, what does it mean in terms of remembrance? Do we have to find a new approach in our remembrance politics?
Thank you, Raphael Groß, for those explanations on the topic of minorities. I actually didn't mean it in a legal sense. I totally agree to what you said. And remembrance policy in Germany is always linked to the Holocaust, closely linked to the Holocaust, restricted even to it. So at the moment we are discussing about what it means for the commemoration of remembrance policy when the eyewitnesses are not alive anymore. Who can take over their role? Can we preserve their reports digitally? So you mentioned a new aspect. How do we deal with the fact that those who have been murdered during the Holocaust actually always saw themselves as part of the very society that killed them and demanded equal rights rather than minority rights, saw themselves as citizens of this country. That's a very interesting aspect, and I do think that we need to take account of that in our commemoration remembrance policy. I don't have a conclusive answer to that now. Yes, that's what we're here for on this panel, to think together. I think we're going to go home with more questions than answers. And I think that's not a bad thing, because I'm a journalist and that's my nature. Yes, I started my remarks with Richard Koher and Hans Rösner as drastic fascist personalities interested in history. And I just wanted to highlight that thinking about history, being interested in history, doesn't necessarily mean that you have the political positions that we like, because Himmler's statistical expert was massively interested in Jewish history, I have to say, even decades after the war. And I think it's the same thing about commemoration and remembrance. There was one filmmaker who died this year or last year, Colland. He came from a German Jewish family. He lived in England, and he approached me several times when I was working for the Fritz Bauer Institute, and he kept saying, I'm interested in the memories of the perpetrators. I want to collect the memories of the perpetrators. And nobody supported him. He went to the Stiftung Erinnerung, Verantwortung und Zukunft and all kinds of other foundations, and nobody supported him, as if these memories were not valuable and as if these memories were not influential for Germany in the decades after the war. But these memories are totally excluded. We are interested in the Shoah Foundation, in the Spielberg Foundation, in the family histories of Jewish families, and we think this is very important, and it is, but we ignore the history of the perpetrators, because there's a lot that we can learn from that as well. And there's a vacuum regarding that. And I think it would be helpful if we would enlarge or widen our understanding of commemoration policy. And commemoration policy or commemoration culture is one of the terms I don't like, because it sounds as if it's a positive thing to remember the Holocaust, a romantic thing kind of, and it's not. I never accepted that as a positive thing, and I think it's more complex, it's more multifaceted than that. And I think these topics can become empty and shallow with time if you see them from a one-sided point of view. And I think it would become more interesting again if we would also focus on the perpetrator's perspective. There was one panel discussion about the Israeli film The Flat, Hadira. It's an Israeli film that shows how complex history actually is, and how this couple who moved from Germany to Israel because they were Jewish kept up their friendship with the German Nazi couple, or rather a German couple that became a Nazi couple after they met, and they continued their friendship even after the war. And I think that's a very fascinating story, because these are the complex aspects of history, and it's a daring, courageous step to make a film about such a complex topic. And I think that's important. Raphael Groß, when you were the head of the Leo-Baeck of the Institute, did you invent a new term for the commemoration culture, the term you don't like? Well, no, I think it doesn't make sense to just replace that term. I think you need to ask different questions. And I wasn't the head, I was the head of the Fritz Bauer Institute, where we had this working group on commemoration culture. And at the Fritz Bauer Institute, I then said that we should talk about moral and National Socialism. Because we found that, as you see even today, for example with the corona deniers, that these are often very moral-based or pseudo-moral-based viewpoints. The points brought forward by these groups, the points that anti-Semitic stereotypes are based on, are often very moral, and they're based on moral grounds or pseudo-moral grounds. So I'm interested in the way that shared morals or shared pseudo-morals are actually relevant for society. And in what way did National Socialism manage to strengthen these moral viewpoints? And what was left of that after 45? What was the echo of it? Martin Walser had a famous speech in the Pauls Church about, well, and I asked myself about the echo of these stories.
Noch mal ein bisschen zurückzuspulen, diese sofort, Frau Küchler, nicht vergessen, was Sie sagen wollten, auch liebes Publikum. Sie sind auch herzlich
So in the audience, don't forget to ask your questions.
gesprochen haben auf der klassischen Täter- und Opferseite und eben auch
You,
Grauzonen der Moral zu beleuchten.
to summarize it, you want us to look at the gray zones of morals as well. And I'm very grateful for that idea. It's very interesting. Yes, I would just like to add that, of course, there are places where research on the perpetrators is done. For example, the topography of terror and Stanislav Hans' book about the command of Sobibor. But of course, that's not so much compared to the research on the victims and research on the suffering of Jews in National Socialism. Yes, and I think there's also a kind of silence in the families of the perpetrators. I think in the Jewish families, there is more communication about these stories, although there's also a lot of silence. But in the perpetrators' families, there's an overwhelming silence, which also means or leads to a disbalance in our memories of the past. Yes, there's an institute in Bielefeld that carried out a study on how family histories are talked about, and half of our population in Germany is convinced that their family members were resistance fighters. They were in the opposition or in the resistance. So that's an interesting outcome of that silence. And we thought about the role of a Jewish museum. Would there be a Jewish museum without the Holocaust? What would the museum exhibit? Maybe still the stories of pogroms? Or would it be a folkloric institution? Do we need Jewish museums? Isn't that something that separates our society? Yes, I came across that question just recently because I read a statement by a young person who said that Jews for him are something from the past. He was interested in Jews and in Jewish life, and that he asked all his questions in the past tense. He never thought about Jews living in Germany now. So I thought myself, does a Jewish museum not maybe increase that impulse or that dinosaur effect? I was here in the Jewish Museum Berlin with my kids recently, and I was very happy about the big share of the Jewish present in the exhibition. Those videos that are shown of Jews who live in Berlin now and report from their life as it's taking place today, report from their religious practices or of the fact that they don't have any religion. So I found that very impressive and very positive, and I think it's extraordinarily important for a Jewish museum to include the present, to prevent the dinosaur effect, as you called it. Yes, and I think this museum is doing it extremely well, especially in the new permanent exhibition. And by the way, in Germany, I keep hearing in Germany we have a very diverse Jewish community with a multitude of interesting voices, all kinds of religious groups combined in this community, so small but very interesting. Raphael Groß, do you see it that way as well? Because you're from Switzerland and you've also lived in London and other parts of the world. Do you perceive it like that? Well, first let me say something about the Jewish museums. They have a very important role to play in Germany, talking about Jewish life in the past and today. The Jewish museums are extremely important in Germany because they are museums for non-Jews. The Jewish Museum in Frankfurt had a predecessor, and that was the Jewish Museum for Antiques and the Antiquity. And that was more for a Jewish audience because people who went there already had a lot of knowledge about these objects. And the Jewish museums in Germany now, they are very focused on explaining to non-Jews things about Jewish life. So I think that's a very important function they have. But when you open up your perspective, you see that, for example, the Jewish Museum in New York, where the Lubeck Institute is based, has a different perspective on Jewish culture and history. And it's a different audience there as well. It's also an art museum that collects art, and we wouldn't think about that here in the museum. So it has a different function. But I think we all agree that the Jewish Museum in Berlin is very... oh, the interpreter lost the sound for a second. Now it's back. Yes, the Jewish Museum has a very important role to play for the Jewish community in Germany. It's probably bigger than the community even thinks themselves, because they like to criticize the museum. But I think it still has a very big meaning for the community, not only the one in Berlin, but also the one in Frankfurt and in other cities. Yes, and I think we should honor that. So the multitude of Jewish voices, is that a point that you're interested in? Do you think that there is a multitude of Jewish voices in Germany? Well, I curated many exhibitions on stories of conflict in Frankfurt, and I do the same in the German Historical Museum, but usually not about the present. So I don't see myself as a historian explaining the present. I think to understand things as a historian, it's a good idea to let some time pass. So if we look at the Fassbinder controversy, for example, looking back, we get a feeling for what happened back then in the political landscape after the Shoah, or when we look at Bubis and the whole discussion about Bubis, that gives us a clear impression. But as an historian, I wouldn't say so much about Jewish life today. I think the communities themselves have to answer that question. You mentioned some very important milestones in the history after the war, who questioned the Jewish-German relationship, and many people were very critical about that. And I have a question from the audience that refers to the multitude of voices. Question by Billy Weitzer. During those 3 days, there was a lot of conversation about the multitude of Jews in Germany. How should 1,700 years of Jewish life in German-speaking lands be celebrated for those Jews who came to Germany over the last 30 years? And how relevant would they be for them? Why would they be relevant for them? Well, I think this multitude of voices is fascinating. And it's diversity in terms of religion, in terms of country of origin, language. And it's a big achievement that things are kept together, that the Jewish community runs smoothly and included so many people who came from the former Soviet Union, for example, in the 90s. So all of these people have been integrated really well into the community. So, of course, for young people who came here as children or were born here, there are now difficult questions of identity. How religious am I? How Ukrainian am I? How Jewish am I? How German am I? I think these are difficult questions. And in this search of identity, to look back in history, to look back into the Jewish history, I think that can be helpful to answer Billy Weitz's question. I think knowing more about the history would be a big contribution to help with this search of identity. So a different narrative about Jewish life in Germany, you mean? Yes. There's another question here from the audience. To look into the future, what would you like to happen in the next 10 to 20 years? Probably with a view to shared history, you mean? And how to handle Jewish-German history, controversial history? Are there any visions, wishes for the future? Well, it is my impression that the idea that institutions like archives or research institutions or museums help people to build up an identity and to shape the future. I'm very skeptical about that. I don't see that as our task. For me, as an historian, it's not my job. Yes, I understand that you are responsible for history. Yes. I curated an exhibition on Germany in the German Historical Museum, and part of that exhibition was the migration of Russian-speaking migrants to Germany. And I think for many people from the former Soviet Union, this exhibition was a reason to come to our German Historical Museum. Because they now felt part of the German history. Before, they weren't so interested in coming to the museum because they weren't so interested in Heine, for example. They had their own cultural canon, their own cultural interests, and we couldn't tell them to be interested in Braun and Heine just because they had moved to our country. And now forget about the day of the victory of the Soviet army. It's not relevant anymore. Now you should care more about the Holocaust Memorial Day. You can't prescribe that to people just because they have migrated. And they only became interested in our historical museum because they became part of our exhibition. And I think it's Marxist or Leninist if you know what way history should move in the future. I think institutions shouldn't work like that and shouldn't think like that. It's not our task to shape identities. And it's not only me as a historian refusing to answer questions about the present. I just think we need to be very clear about what our task is. We offer a forum, we offer the liberty, the freedom to talk about topics openly. We talk about the past, we discuss terminology, and we don't have to agree on anything for the future. Okay, maybe it's different for politicians, isn't it? Politicians are usually interested in shaping the future, aren't they? Well, I have a wish for the future. My wish is that we will not have the anti-Semitism that we have in Germany at the moment, that we will be able to push that back and give Jews the feeling that they have a safe life in Germany and that they don't have to pack the suitcases. Because in 1945, it was actually a miracle that Jewish citizens stayed in Germany. For many displaced persons, Germany was only one place that they had to pass through, but then they kind of got stuck. And it's also amazing that there was such a big immigration of Jews into Germany in the 90s. I find that a miracle. I find that astonishing. And my vision for the next 10 years would be that those people, those Jewish citizens in Germany feel at home and feel safe. Well, it's interesting that you talk about getting the suitcases from the basement, because I grew up as a Jew in Western Berlin with that feeling of sitting on packed suitcases. It was highly debated in the Jewish families in my surroundings. And then most suitcases were unpacked in the around the year 2000. And a new generation grew up that felt much more self-confident as part of German society. And over the last years, this feeling is again weakened, this feeling of safety. Another interesting question from the audience. If you speak about the second and third generation of Holocaust survivors, can we also talk about the second or third generation of perpetrators? How do you see that? Yes, of course. And this is something that, from my point of view, we don't discuss enough, at least not in my bubble. Let me give you one interesting example. I know one person who has thought a lot about that topic, Alexandra Senft, the story of her family. That included one big Nazi criminal who was put to death later. He committed lots of crimes in Slovakia, and Alexandra Senft did a lot of research and wrote a fascinating account of that part of history and put it in a fascinating context. And I think her work is extremely productive. You can learn a lot from that. And I think you can learn about mechanisms that influence our society until today, much more than we think. much more than we would like to believe, and much more than we understand when we only identify with the stories of Holocaust survivors. I think it's much more difficult to face the memories and history of the perpetrators and to be interested in that. But I think it would be extremely important. I have another question from the audience, but I think we're not the right persons to answer that question, to be honest. But I'm going to tell you what it is anyway. The question is where the deficits are when we talk about the integration of the Russian-speaking migrants to Germany. Were there any deficits, and what aspects did you observe in the or surprised you in the Russian-speaking community over the last 30 years? I don't think it's the right panel for that here, but do you have any opinions on that? Anything you have observed, maybe private opinions?
30 years after the transformation. Oh, I don't know whether you need a specific panel to talk about these 30 years, but yes, it is a very central, focal issue. Dimitri Balki spoke about the German Jewry 2.0, and to come back to the Leo Baeck Institute, he said that the era of the German Jewry ended in 1933. And I take this very seriously, and I was a director of the Leo Baeck Institute for 15 years when I think this is right, because what we are having now, Jewish life, is not the same Jewish life that we had before 1933. It's something completely different. And it's not a judgment, and it's not, I don't want to value it, but it's a completely different story. We need the different observation for this, but it has been done in many ways in different conferences and research, and we've had conferences on the integration of Russian Jews at Leo Baeck Institute for the last 10 years. And I don't know how this can be seen as a joint, as a common history, or assessed as a common history, but this is the task a historian should do. But this is also an important topic in the Jewish Museum of Berlin, the immigration of Jews from the former Soviet states, and there is a whole department dedicated to this topic. Well, yeah, many questions, of course. This is something that we expected, actually. And thank you very much for your thoughts, for your ideas. Ms. Küchler, Mr. Gross, thank you. Thank the virtual audience. I hope that you've learned new things in this conference, and that it has given you some food for thought, and I would be happy to see you at some place, New York or somewhere else, at the next conference. Now I will pass the floor to William Weitzer to New York. Billy, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I want to thank Shelly, Raphael, and Michaela for a wonderful conversation. I was smiling while you struggled with the definition of shared history. Please note that the topic was with a question mark, and you did question it a lot and had a very good conversation about that. It has been an amazing 3 days of panels, papers, and even virtual coffee breaks. Well, I'm certain that everyone has had enough screen time this week, and throughout the pandemic, I ask that you spare me 2 minutes to extend some thanks. First off, to all of you for listening, asking questions, and putting up with technological challenges. To our funders, the German Foreign Ministry and the BPAB. To the facility support from the Jewish Museum Berlin as a great partner. To the participation by opening and closing panelists, paper session chairs, and those who wrote papers. And to the translators who helped us in both languages. And last but not least, to the staff support from so many at the Leo Baeck Institute, but especially Milena Rink and Miriam Bistrovich from our Berlin office. Finally, I ask that everyone listening stay connected to the Shared History Project during the coming year, starting with our virtual exhibit that was mentioned tonight that will reveal each week a new object, essays, and related information about Jewish life in German-speaking lands. And for those of you who are in Berlin, I hope you'll be able to visit our physical exhibit, which opens in late January in the Bundestag and will be there until the end of April. Thank you. Please give us feedback on our project. As I said, please participate. Stay safe and well in the coming days and weeks.